Josh Fisher is an associate professor of environmental science at the Schmid College of Science and Technology at Chapman University, and he's the science lead for a space company called Hydrosat. Josh, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Joe.
So to kick us off, I'd love to ask you, like, as a climate scientist, how do we save the planet?
Yeah, a lot of people kind of get depressed or overwhelmed when it comes to solving climate change related issues, both impacts and solutions. But as a climate scientist, I yearn for the challenge. I yearn to solve complex puzzles. And I think it started when I was a kid, and I think I played too many video games, and there was always like a way to be more complex games or complex levels, right? You had to figure out the kind of the system and how to beat the bad boss or find the like sword or whatever it is. And so, as I grew out of my kid years into my adult years as a scientist, I see climate change as that ultimate complex problem where you're mixing people and plants and the atmosphere and the land together in policy and figuring out how do you optimize and solve the key questions to understand what's happening to the planet and hand that off to policy. So, so within climate change and climate science, that's a broad, sweeping area. My focus is on land, right? So I engage with my ocean buddies and my atmosphere buddies, but I'm focused on land, especially ecosystems, agriculture, forests, and things like that. My main goal is to really understand how do ecosystems function and respond to changes like from climate change or other weather or human influences. How can we monitor that? How can we predict those responses? And Are there underlying mathematical equations that describe the process? Just like in a video game, there's math behind it, there's code behind it. What is the code behind how the world works? Like the shirt, the matrix. Um, can we see how the system works and changes? And so um, I started off doing a lot of mathematical modeling and trying to predict, especially water resources. I grew up in California and Alaska. My parents split when I was little, so I went to school in LA with my mom and then went to visit my dad in the summers and winters in Alaska. And in the 80s, we were undergoing major droughts in California, and we were putting on like low flow shower heads and toilets in my mom's place in LA, and I go up to Alaska and we were putting on high flow shower heads. And just that juxtaposition kind of struck me. And coming back to California with all these droughts, I thought, well, how do we know how much water we're going to have any given year? And so I started getting into the predictive capabilities and trying to figure out what did we know and what didn't we know? And I started focusing on what we didn't know and what we couldn't see very well, which was at the time the evaporation. So we could measure rain from rain gauges. Um, we can measure groundwater through wells and river runoff through river gauges as well. But we couldn't measure the evaporation, that big loss, which is, the half of the coin there. And so I started playing with models to predict evapotranspiration, which is the evaporation off the land and the transpiration through plants. And it's driven by the same type of stuff that, would drive water evaporating from your hands after you wash your hands. If it's hot and dry and windy, that'll evaporate the water. It's the same with the world. When you have more radiation, when it's hotter, when it's drier, you'll have more evaporation. And when you have humid air and less radiation, you will have less evaporation. So starting to use those variables to predict it. And then and then in my PhD, it was kind of when we had a whole fleet of NASA Earth observing satellites to play with. And I thought, oh, those are cool toys to play with in the sky. Can I start to use satellites to see how much evapotranspiration is happening all over the world? And so I developed one of the first global models using remote sensing satellites to observe and predict how much water was being lost off the surface of the planet. And at that time, climate change kind of blew up, and I was in a spot where I was observing global cycles, predicting how it was functioning. Um, and that lent itself to seeing how that was changing with climate change. So my work has spanned the mathematical modeling to the satellite remote sensing, and then what we can't see, I have to go into the field. So I've done a lot of field work and field campaigns in the areas where we have the least data, especially the tropics and the Arctic. So I've spent years in especially the tropics. I just got back from Costa Rica 2 days ago, running a campaign there through the rainforest and the volcanoes, looking at a natural experiment. So yeah, so my work spans the modeling, the remote sensing, and the field work.
So within the context of that work, um, have you been able, you mentioned both the power of observing and then the power to predict. Are you able to kind of using the technology at your fingertips predict our trajectory and say with some level of certainty we are on this path, and then coming back to the, like, how do we address all these problems? Are you able to uh, kind of put forward different simulations within your modeling to understand, like, if we were to do X, then Y would happen? What does that look like, and how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, so there's both certainty and uncertainty in climate models. There's certainty in that we know, CO2 emissions are increasing, and there's going to be more trapped energy, which is going to accelerate the water cycle and melt ice and things like that. So, and we know that temperature is going to raise, but there's uncertainty in terms of like exactly what's going to happen at exactly what time, and there's uncertainty in terms of especially tipping points. And so that's something that I look at a lot. And so, for instance, you're increasing CO2 in the atmosphere, and plants are taking it up because they eat CO2, but they also require other things to grow in addition to CO2. They need water, they need light, and so on, and nutrients. And so, at some point, you start to run out of water, you start to run out of nutrients, and when that happens, you start to disable ecosystem's ability to absorb all that CO2 we're absorbing. So what's that point? What's that tipping point at which things are good? We're emitting, plants are absorbing, but then they stop, and then things get really bad. So there's that. Like in the Arctic, I mentioned there's been thousands of years of carbon locked up in the permafrost, right? So if you think about the Arctic, it's kind of this shrubby, mossy ecosystem landscape. And so these shrubs and mosses like grow and then they die, but then they don't decompose because it's so cold. You don't have like worms and stuff up there to eat them. So all this dead plant material just sits there and then gets like layered on by another layer of ice and snow, and then again and rinse and repeat for thousands of years. So you've got all this carbon that had never really decomposed, just like locked up in the permafrost. But now as things are heating up, that permafrost is thawing, and all this carbon is now being released and warming, and bugs are coming in and eating them. And it's even worse because now the bugs are coming in and eating these plants, and instead of respiring that plant matter CO2 because of the waterlogged conditions, it's coming up as methane, which is even more potent greenhouse gas. So that's a tipping point, for example, where at what point do you like release all this carbon back to the atmosphere, just you know, like blasting the atmosphere with CO2 or methane, and then causing things to get even worse and warming up and like spiraling out of control. So, and you can't just like reabsorb thousands of years of carbon, by planting moss or trees up there. So it's not easily mitigatable um, in any obvious solution right now. Other tipping points that are kind of more local to home that we've been working on is looking at food crashes. So, as around the world, we've got a growing population, billions of people on the planet and growing. And so our ability as a human civilization to thrive and grow and be prosperous is dependent on stability. We need climate stability so we can plant and then grow, and the next year plant and grow again. And when humans evolved, climate was kind of unstable. We plant down a civilization, and then there would be some, biblical flood or, drought that'd wipe us out. And it wasn't until the climate stabilized that we were suddenly able to like grow and grow and grow. And that was the Neolithic kind of agricultural age. Um, but now things are becoming unstable, right? So now we're having, these more extremes in rainfall and heat waves and things like that. And so now you have times when farmers can't plant anything because there's just no water. Or they plant something and they don't get the water they expected, or there's a heat wave that comes and ravishes um, their crops, or there's a heat wave and the plants are just vulnerable, but then they're kind of like surviving. But because they're vulnerable, some like pathogen comes in and devastates their crops. So it's been challenging, and we've seen this for decades, where you have these famines in like Somalia and and Africa, but now they're hitting a lot closer to home and more frequently. And so the question is, can we predict and monitor and mitigate those food crashes? And so my team has been using satellite remote sensing and a lot of tipping point advanced like statistics and math to be able to predict these food crashes before they occur. And you want to predict them like well before they occur, so you can mobilize assistance, right? So um, like if you think about a famine in a whole country, like in East Africa or something, um, that's a lot of people dependent on that. And so you can't just be like, oh, food crash, we'll go hook you up with some burgers like tomorrow. Like, no, you need like 3 to 6 months of advanced, mobilization to get that scale of help to, provide stability. And so that means you need to predict these like crashes 3 to 6 months before it happens, which is like crazy. Like, can we do that? Turns out we can. So we've been able to predict every single food crash in the history of the satellite record before it occurs, 3 to 6 months before it occurs. And not only just predicting when it happens, but the magnitude. Is it a big crash? Is it a little crash? And we can also predict when it recovers, which is important for moving that assistance to other areas of the world that need assistance. Um, so, yeah, that's been some of our scientific or some of our more recent scientific discoveries on related to like tipping points in the climate system, and and now we got to get that science and that technology into the hands outside of scientists, really, into policymakers, into the World Bank and the UN and things like that. So that we can help people if we want to help people. I also leave the helping people to my fellow citizens of the world. A lot of what I do as a scientist is to help people and to understand the world. But if the world isn't interested in helping each other, then the science will just remain isolated.
Yeah. So with regard to that 3 to 6 month um, prediction time horizon, is it the remote sensing that you mentioned, that you're able to sense something that's going on with the hydrological cycle, or what is it that allows you to predict that far in advance? And can you get even further in advance with your predictions, maybe with the supercomputing, or maybe the application of AI? How do you think about that?
Yeah, so to be able to do this, you need to kind of understand the system, like really understand the system. Kind of like I keep referring back to this Matrix thing, right? Like, Keanu Reeves and Neo like kind of like understood how the Matrix worked, and so then he could you know, do whatever it was that he did in it. But you also need to be able to observe how the system's working. If you don't have the data, then your understanding will be limited. So you need to understand it and like observe what's going on, bring those together, and then you can actually do something about it. Um, and the observing at a global scale really has to come from remote sensing, from satellites. And so there's a number of different like we've kind of had this revolution, this golden age over my career um, of different ways of measuring different parts of the the climate system. And so, like in terms of the water cycle, we can now measure rain from space. We can measure if the snow's there. We can do evapotranspiration. We can do the surface soil moisture. We can even measure deep groundwater, which you think, how do you see the deep groundwater? But we can, and I can tell you about that if you're interested. Um, and so now we can start to put these together. But are we seeing these different parts of the water cycle and the carbon cycle and nutrient cycles and other aspects of ecosystems? Are we seeing them with enough fidelity? Do we see them in the high enough resolution so we can differentiate, some parts of the forest that are stressed and other parts that are fine, so we know that when there's a drought, these species are going to die, or wildfire is going to move into some areas, faster and hotter than others. Um, so before I was at Chapman and Hydrostat, I was at NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab. So I was a NASA scientist for about 12 years. And there I was the science lead for a mission that we launched to the International Space Station called EcoStress. And it uses thermal infrared remote sensing, looking at basically the temperature to the touch of the planet. And so using that with high resolution, we can see that when plants are hot, they don't have enough water, and when they're cool, they have enough water. And so then we can use that to get at how much water they're using, the evapotranspiration. Um, and so that was a big breakthrough in using the space station as a platform. Hadn't really been done for that type of science. So we were really kind of thinking creatively and outside the box to use that platform not only to observe the planet, but then use it to have it for power, to power our instrument, to use it for the data communications and downlink, which helped drive down the cost of our mission because the space station already had those up there waiting for us. Um, but eco stress isn't measuring every day. And the resolution is about 70 meters, which is kind of the three-quarters of the size of a football field. So it's a little bit big. Whereas most farms are like, I mean, usually the field size is less than 100 meters, depends where you are on the planet. So you really want to figure out if you're going to help farmers, for example, or even differences in forested ecosystems. You want high resolution. And you want to know every day because things change every day. Farmers are out there irrigating and managing their crops every day. Heat waves can come in and scorch a forest within a 3 to 5 day time frame. And so eco stress was measuring maybe on average every 3 to 5 days. It was a little inconsistent because the space station orbit's a little bit funky. Um, and then the next best satellite at high resolution was Landsat, and that's every 16 days. So it really wasn't good enough temporal resolution. And so some of my colleagues at JPL developed basically this technology that we had sent to Mars to measure the temperature of Mars, and they thought they could, accelerate this technology in the commercial sphere. And so they formed this company called Hydrosat. And then I left JPL 4 years ago to become the science lead for Hydrosat, and it was more advanced technology than we were doing in NASA and elsewhere. So that's really exciting. And we basically were using similar technology to Landsat and EcoStress, but we were able to make it a lot cheaper and smaller and faster, so we could put up a lot more of these satellites. So we had our first launch just last year. We have our next launch in a month or two from now. So we're just continuing to put more of these sensors up in space so we can have this great view of high resolution temperature dynamics every day, multiple times a day. And then we transmit that data into our applications platforms, which give farmers basically every day information on which fields need more water and like which fields are stressed, and helps them manage their crops when we have or now when we have more variability and stresses to the agricultural system. The same can be said for forestry too. We've got the data to inform forest managers and wildfire fighters to say these parts of the forest are drying out, and this is where you should have mitigations through thinning or other wildfire controlled burns to mitigate the spread of really like huge wildfires. So the combination of getting that technology out there for satellites and remote sensing, mixed with our math and our understanding. And now I'm starting to bring in this like societal application. Can we now take these data and this understanding and put it into an app that you as a farmer can be on your tractor and load it up and be like, oh, I need to go over to this field because that's what the satellite information is telling me. And that's a whole nother level because we need to use UI, UX designers, and outreach specialists. And it's not just, kind of scientists who are analyzing data anymore. It's now this whole ecosystem of engineering to science to outreach, and making it all sustainable, so that we can cover all our costs and make it worth the investment of the users.
So is it conceivable that with this technology, you could make it so that anybody that's using the technology and anywhere that the satellites can see would never approach the tipping points associated with food crashes anymore? Like the fact that you have the information, you know when to water, is it conceivable that like we would see less, we would be approaching less food crashes because of that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, it's a bit of a fight, right? So while we can help you um, reduce your probability of getting food crash, good, the probability of getting a food crash is increasing because of climate change. So it's a bit of a race, and a bit of a fight. So while, if everything, if like climate change was like as it is and like, which is kind of bad, but like didn't get worse and didn't get better, like we could definitely help you avoid those food crashes. But like, are we helping you fast enough to this rate? So, I mean, an analogy to the food crashes is that, I spent a lot of time in Peru, working as part of a big project looking at, a lot of different questions of, tropical species in the Amazon and up the flank of the Andes as this like natural climate change, gradient where you had the same like weather conditions, but it just got colder as you moved up the Andes. And so what we saw, some of our team members have published, some pretty high profile papers on this, is that the species in the Amazon were basically racing out of the Amazon up the Andes to avoid the heat, right? At migration rates we had never seen before, like
Mm.
unprecedented. We had also found that they weren't migrating fast enough. Climate change was accelerating even faster than they could get out of there. And so it's the similar type of analogies to this technology and societal applications. Our technology is advancing and our ability to help is accelerating, but are we accelerating and advancing fast enough? And that remains to be seen.
So I want to go back for a second to the remote sensing. You mentioned that you're able to see or do some kind of measurement for deep groundwater. Is that using the same type of remote sensing? And you also mentioned like the fidelity and the high resolution. Are you able to get the same quality of data and information when you're looking at groundwater as when you're looking on the surface?
Yeah, no, it's different technology. Actually, I think almost all components of the water cycle use different technology. So, with rain, right, with weather forecasts, you've probably seen, what's the radar telling us, right? So it uses radar technology. The radar, interacts with the clouds and the water droplets. For the evaporation and the plant water use, that's temperature, right? So it's the surface temperature measurements, it's thermal measurements. For for the deep groundwater, how do we see that, right? How do you see deep groundwater? So, this comes back to gravity, right? And this is like kind of a phenomenal, technological insight into this. So, how is gravity formed? You have more gravity when you have more what? More mass, right? Bigger things have more gravity. And so, if you were to run a satellite, over the Earth, it gets pulled to the Earth based on the gravitational pull because there's a lot of mass. Now, if you were to fill up part of the Earth with a bunch of groundwater, when it flew over, it would get pulled a little bit to the Earth, more. And if you sucked out all that groundwater, the next time it flew over, it would get pulled a little less. And so we've got these twin satellites called Grace, and now the Grace follow-on mission that are sensitive to gravitational anomalies, and so and down to like the centimeter level, and so they kind of feel this like tug and pull against each other related to the mass they're flying over, and that mass could change because of ice melt or sea level rise, but the over land, the biggest change is going to be that groundwater. Is it there or not? And so we can see how much groundwater is basically, or it's really, we can't see like the absolute amount because we don't know how much is there. We just know the change. And so you do have to calibrate it. So we know as you fly over, one time it changed from the last time, and so we know it's like getting worse and worse and worse. But that's how we get at the deep groundwater. But back to your question on resolution, it's super coarse resolution. So like you can't just like dump your water bottle out on your lawn and like have it like detect that groundwater change. It's like big, like a whole like valley, a watershed scale is what it sees those differences of. Um, so the gravitational measurements aren't super fine resolution, but there's other technology out there like looking at subtle variations in the surface of the planet. So if you're like walking along, some patch of land and, one day and then you sucked out all the groundwater and you walked over it the next day, you would actually be a little bit lower than you were because that water kind of pushed out the land a little bit. You don't notice it, but we can see it from our sensors. And so if you think about GPS, right, and like cell phone towers or GPS, they're very sensitive to location. And so if they sink a little bit, they will tell you. So you can actually use like a network of GPS sensors to see the deformation or like this like swelling or shrinking of the land related to groundwater change. And so that'll give you a little bit more fidelity if you have the sensors there. So lots of interesting technology, but again, it comes down to like, can you understand how the system works? Can you understand what technology is useful and what do you actually need to measure to influence, society and what society wants to know for management?
Yeah. For the groundwater, is it that we know the characteristics of the groundwater that we're looking for, and that allows us to measure it? Because I'm wondering, like, what if it was a liquid of something else? It wasn't water, but there was liquid, and so
Oil.
how does the technology, or how does our methodology able to determine that it's groundwater versus something else?
Yeah, so you just have to know a little bit. So like we've seen oil, for example, oil extraction. And so that's a big, change there. Also fracking a little bit too. So um, but then, sometimes you could fly over a mountain pass and you had a bunch of snow there, and then that snow all melted. Uh,
Hmm.
and then, so there'd be like less, and then that snow melted and ran off into a river far away. And so then you'd have less mass there. And that wouldn't be groundwater, it would be snow. But you just kind of have to know the system a little bit of what you're looking at to be like, yeah, there was snow there. Now there's not. So part of that signal was snow.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, so when thinking about the climate models, and all the data that we have, um, I mean, how advanced are we? Like you described our predictive ability for the food crashes to be through, like we can look 3 to 6 months out, and we're able to predict a tipping point. Are we that advanced with climate models? Can we predict major tipping, like the one you described in the what you described in the Arctic? Sounds like it's a tipping point that's happening. Is that accurate, or is that not quite a tipping point? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it depends what we're interested in. Like, is it going to occur under certain circumstances? I think we're pretty confident on in those tipping points. When it's going to occur, is it in 5 years or 8 years? That's a little less uncertain. So, or a little less certain. So, there's again certainty and uncertainty depending on the question wrapped up in the sub questions. Um, so, we often hear, oh, climate models are uncertain, but then you're like, no, they totally all agree on some things, right? And a lot of things we're interested in. But that's not what scientists are interested in. We're not really interested in certainty. We're interested in uncertainty because that's where we have work to do. And that's why we always talk about uncertainty and things that we're working on and focusing on, because there's nothing to do if the model is perfect. And so there are parts of the model where it's really good, and we don't do a lot of work on that because it's pretty good. So we do work on parts where it's not so good.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Well, so how does this research and the modeling translate um, to policy and to have you seen examples where you're able to do some of these predictions and understand things like food crashes and then talk to a government and they're able to act with some expediency?
Yeah, I mean that's the hardest part, right? So, I mean, even when you do have governments that are like, doing something about it, then the governments change, and then, you gotta start all over again or whatnot. So it's that the policy realm, um, I don't have the answers to. Yeah, can't help you there. I think that the best way, from my perspective, to help the policy side is to just communicate the science a lot better, and what we can do, and not only communicate the science, but also understand that there are trade-offs, that different societies, cultures, politicians, politics have, that they're making as well. So, um, and you've got, I think fundamentally everybody is really concerned about, their community and their family and friends and things like that. But then they've got other, trade-offs they've got to make with economics and, you know, keeping in office and, attention to lobbyists and, the system and things like that. So, it's a big challenge on the policy side. But I think understanding the values and the language that, different types of people use allows you to communicate your science and technology and excitement to, meet those values where they're at. So, um, like for instance, under President Trump's first presidency, when I was at NASA, he appointed, head of NASA, Jim Bridenstine. And Jim Bridenstine was a stated climate denier. And then after kind of he made his rounds and talked to all the NASA scientists and things like that, he realized, oh, it actually is real. He didn't really understand it. And so then he came out publicly saying, yeah, it's real. And then he goes back and talks to Vice President Pence and, the Republican constituency. And instead of really talking about climate change, he was really talking about the cool technology that we were using to help the farmers and grow jobs and have food and water security. And those were things that, are valued on both sides of the aisle. And so, there were ways to kind of communicate to Jim Bridenstine, and I had a chance to tell him about eco stress and the technology, and he got really jazzed about it. And he was on national TV talking about the thermal technology and the stomata and things like that. And he just really loved the tech, and that was just us being able to communicate, that in a way that got him really excited and allowed him to talk to constituencies that we didn't really have access to as scientists, or as PhD level, whatever it is. So I think it's important to be able to communicate, and get people, not only communicate, but get people really excited about the science, because everyone is a born scientist. Just the system beats it out of us. And so it's about trying to find that inner scientist in every single person and getting them excited, about it.
Yeah. Well, pulling on that thread a little bit, what advice would you give to young people aspiring to do climate research?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of, young people really want to save the planet now, and it's a marathon, not a sprint. Um, and but we do have to sprint in times, and so there are areas in which we are sprinting heavily. So I mentioned my company Hydrosat, um, and we are part of this, commercial revolution in space technology where we are out there sprinting. We basically took the baton from NASA, and now we're doing that like next stretch, super fast. And a lot of, young people are trying to figure out where can they best help, which sector can they best help in. Is it going to be in government? Is it going to be in academia? Is it going to be in NGO? Is it going to be in industry? And it's those walls have really come down, especially post pandemic, where we do a lot of remote work, and um, and people moved around laterally so much that there isn't like, and you can go and you can do both, right? I am in academia and in industry and was formerly at NASA, right? So, and I still work a lot with my NASA buddies and NOAA and things like that. So, um, I think that you just have to kind of figure out what you want to do, and there's a lot of opportunities to go do it. And then you just want to be really good at it, right? You can't go do it. There's got to be, you're not going to get the job if you're not good at it. So um, I think that's the next question that young people will want to ask is like, what do I have to study or do or be good at to do what I want? Well, it depends what you want to do. So if you want to be on the outreach side of things, like I said with my company, this whole ecosystem from the engineering to the science to the um, to the outreach, and like what part of that ecosystem do you want to do? So one of my colleagues, Caroline Familietti, she was my intern at NASA, um, and then she went off to do a PhD at Stanford, and we kept in touch. And then she's brilliant, and when she was graduating, she came to me for career advice and said, "What do you want to do? Do you want to go be a professor? Go into NGO, go into government? What do you want to do?" And she started describing essentially what we were doing at Hydrosat, which is like being on the cutting edge, interfacing with users and engineering and science. And I'm like, well, that's what we're doing here. Do you want to come, work with us at Hydrosat? And she was like my best intern ever at JPL. And she wanted to. And so she applied for a job and we hired her and she's been great. And I work with her all the time. So that's an example of a young person who's come out of the system with a lot of options on the table, having worked hard and kind of figuring out through some other internships and different experiences what she wanted to do, and she's gone and she's doing it. And we're trying to help save the world as well through Hydrosat.
That's awesome. Well, Josh, thank you so much for taking the time to share insights about the work you're doing, and I hope we can continue the conversation down the road.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Joe. And if any of your listeners or viewers are interested in anything that I had to say, feel free to reach out. Give me a shout out. I'm on LinkedIn and Blue Sky and Twitter and all that stuff. So you can find me. But and I tend to post updates of our latest scientific findings or trips in the field or whatever. So yeah, if you're interested in what I just talked about, you can keep up with my latest through those platforms.
Awesome.